Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling smaller than when you walked in? Like somehow your value just dropped without anyone saying it directly? That feeling isn't random. It's a signal, and ignoring it can slowly destroy your confidence. Most people think disrespect is obvious, yelling, insults, or open hostility. But the truth is, the most damaging disrespect is subtle. It hides inside jokes, silence, manipulation, and small moments that slowly teach people how poorly they can treat you. Today we're going to talk about 5 types of disrespect you should never tolerate, because the moment you start allowing them, people begin to believe they are allowed. But before we dive in, ask yourself something honestly. Have you ever stayed silent when someone crossed a line just to avoid conflict? If that's happened to you, you're not alone. In fact, most people do it more often than they realize. Being constantly dismissed is one of the most subtle but damaging forms of disrespect a person can experience. It doesn't always come with loud arguments or obvious insults. Instead, it appears in small, everyday moments that gradually make you feel like your voice carries less value. It happens when you express an opinion and someone immediately talks over you, changes the subject, or responds as if what you said wasn't even worth acknowledging. Over time, these repeated experiences create a quiet message. Your thoughts, feelings, and perspectives don't matter as much as theirs. This type of disrespect can show up in conversations where someone interrupts you before you finish speaking, rolls their eyes when you share an idea, or dismisses your concerns with phrases like, "You're overthinking it," "That's not a big deal," or "You're being dramatic." In professional environments, it can happen when your suggestions are ignored in meetings but later praised when repeated by someone else. In personal relationships, it may appear when your emotions are minimized or brushed aside instead of being understood. The real harm of constant dismissal isn't just the behavior itself, but the psychological impact it creates over time. When someone repeatedly experiences their voice being ignored, they begin to question whether their input is valuable at all. People start speaking less, holding back opinions, or second-guessing themselves before sharing ideas. Confidence slowly erodes because the environment trains them to believe their perspective isn't worth attention. Respectful communication looks very different. Even when people disagree, they still allow each other to finish speaking, acknowledge the point being made, and respond thoughtfully. Dismissive behavior, on the other hand, removes that basic level of consideration. It turns conversations into power dynamics where one person's voice dominates while the other gradually disappears. Recognizing this pattern is important because allowing it repeatedly can normalize a relationship where your thoughts and feelings are treated as optional rather than meaningful. Public humiliation disguised as humor is one of the most common ways disrespect hides in everyday interactions. It often appears harmless on the surface because it is wrapped in laughter, sarcasm, or the phrase, "I'm just joking." But beneath that surface is a pattern where someone repeatedly makes you the target of their jokes in front of others, putting you in a position where you either laugh along or risk looking overly sensitive. This creates an uncomfortable dynamic where the person delivering the joke maintains social control while avoiding responsibility for the hurt they cause. This behavior can show up in many forms. Someone might point out your mistakes in front of a group and laugh about it, mock your appearance or habits, or exaggerate embarrassing stories about you during social gatherings. When people around you laugh, the moment becomes socially reinforced, even if the laughter comes from discomfort rather than genuine amusement. The person being targeted often feels pressure to smile or pretend it doesn't bother them because objecting might make the situation even more awkward. The deeper problem with this kind of humor is that it slowly chips away at a person's dignity. Repeated jokes at your expense can shift how others perceive you, making you seem less competent, less confident, or less worthy of respect. Humor has powerful influence in social groups, And when it is used to repeatedly lower someone's status, it becomes a subtle form of dominance rather than harmless entertainment. Another reason this behavior is harmful is because it places the blame on the person being hurt. When someone finally speaks up and says the joke was offensive, the response is often dismissal. They might hear phrases like, "You can't take a joke," "You're too sensitive," or "Everyone else thought it was funny." These responses shift the focus away from the disrespectful behavior and onto the reaction, making the person feel guilty for expressing discomfort. Healthy humor strengthens relationships and creates shared enjoyment without targeting someone's dignity. When laughter repeatedly comes at one person's expense, it stops being humor and becomes a socially acceptable form of disrespect. Boundary violations happen when someone repeatedly ignores the limits you set for your time, energy, space, or emotional well-being. Boundaries are the invisible guidelines that define what you are comfortable with and what you are not. They protect your mental balance and help maintain healthy relationships. When someone respects you, they recognize those limits and adjust their behavior accordingly. When someone continues to push past them after you have clearly expressed them, it becomes a clear sign of disrespect. This behavior can appear in many everyday situations. You might say you are busy or unavailable, yet someone keeps insisting that you help them immediately. You might decline an invitation, but the person continues to pressure you until you feel guilty enough to give in. In personal relationships, it can happen when someone invades your privacy, reads your messages, shares your personal information without permission, or repeatedly shows up unannounced. In professional environments, it may look like co-workers or supervisors constantly expecting you to work beyond agreed hours or handle responsibilities that were never yours to begin with. What makes boundary violations particularly damaging is the gradual pressure they create. When your limits are ignored often enough, you may start questioning whether your boundaries are reasonable at all. Some people feel guilty for saying no, especially when the other person reacts with disappointment, anger, or manipulation. Over time, this pressure can lead to emotional exhaustion because your needs are continuously pushed aside to satisfy someone else's demands. People who regularly violate boundaries often rely on persistence and emotional pressure. They may frame their requests as favors, obligations, or signs of loyalty, making it harder for you to refuse. The moment you give in repeatedly, it signals that your boundaries are flexible and can be pushed further. Respectful relationships operate differently. When someone hears a clear no or understands a limit, they acknowledge it without trying to force a different outcome. Ignoring boundaries repeatedly transforms a normal relationship dynamic into one where your autonomy and personal comfort are treated as negotiable. Gaslighting is one of the most psychologically damaging forms of disrespect because it targets a person's perception of reality. Instead of openly denying wrongdoing or accepting responsibility, the person manipulates the situation in a way that makes you question your own memory, judgment, or emotional reactions. Over time, this behavior creates confusion and self-doubt, making it harder for you to trust your instincts about what actually happened. This often begins in subtle ways. You might clearly remember something someone said, but when you bring it up later, they insist the conversation never happened or claim you misunderstood it completely. They might say things like, "I never said that," "You're imagining things," or "You're remembering it wrong." Even when you feel certain about what occurred, their repeated denial can slowly make you question yourself. The goal is not necessarily to convince you in a single moment, but to gradually weaken your confidence in your own perception. Gaslighting can also involve minimizing your emotions. When you express that something hurt you or made you uncomfortable, the person might respond with phrases like, "You're too sensitive," "You're overreacting," or "You always make things bigger than they are." Instead of addressing the behavior that caused the issue, they shift the focus onto your reaction, making it seem like the real problem is your response rather than their actions. Another tactic involves rewriting events after they occur. A situation where they were clearly at fault may later be described in a completely different way, sometimes even turning the blame onto you. If this pattern continues long enough, it can create a sense of mental instability where you begin relying on the other person to define what is real or reasonable. The long-term impact of gaslighting can be severe. It erodes self-trust, weakens confidence, and makes a person feel emotionally dependent on the very individual who is manipulating them. Healthy relationships allow open discussion about disagreements and experiences without attempting to distort reality or invalidate someone's perception of events. And if you want more content that helps you protect your confidence and command respect in your life, make sure you subscribe and stick around, because what we're about to talk about might completely change how you deal with people. Taking someone for granted is a quiet but deeply damaging form of disrespect that often develops gradually over time. It happens when a person becomes so accustomed to your effort, support, and presence that they stop recognizing or appreciating it. Instead of valuing what you bring into the relationship, they begin to treat your contributions as something automatic, expected, or even owed to them. This pattern is common in many types of relationships, including friendships, family dynamics, and professional environments. You might be the person who always helps others when they need advice, support, or assistance. Yet when you need the same level of care, the response is distant or non-existent. Your time and energy are consistently available to them, but their effort toward you feels inconsistent or conditional. One sign of being taken for granted is when appreciation disappears. At the beginning of a relationship, people often acknowledge your effort and express gratitude. Over time, however, that recognition can fade. The things you do are no longer noticed because they have become part of an expectation. What was once appreciated becomes seen as your responsibility. When you stop doing those things, the reaction may not be understanding, but frustration or criticism. Another aspect of this disrespect is emotional imbalance. The relationship begins to revolve around the other person's needs, problems, and priorities. They reach out when they require something, whether it is help, attention, or reassurance. But they rarely show the same level of initiative when it comes to supporting you. This creates a one-sided dynamic where one person continuously gives while the other primarily receives. Over time, this imbalance can lead to emotional exhaustion. The person giving more begins to feel drained, undervalued, and overlooked. What makes the situation more difficult is that the effort often comes from genuine care, which makes it harder to recognize when the dynamic has become unhealthy. A respectful relationship maintains balance by acknowledging effort, expressing appreciation, and ensuring that support flows in both directions rather than becoming an expectation placed on only one person. Being spoken to with contempt, sarcasm, or belittling language is a direct attack on a person's dignity. Unlike subtle forms of disrespect, this behavior often carries a tone that immediately makes someone feel small, inferior, or foolish. It may not always involve outright insults, but the delivery, facial expressions, and choice of words communicate a lack of respect. The person speaking may use mocking tones, exaggerated sighs, eye-rolling, or sarcastic remarks that suggest your ideas, feelings, or abilities are not worthy of serious consideration. Sarcasm can sometimes be playful between people who share mutual respect, but when it becomes frequent and targeted, it changes from humor into a weapon. For example, someone might respond to your suggestion with comments like, "Wow, that's a genius idea," said in a clearly mocking tone, or "Sure, because that always works out so well." These remarks are designed to undermine confidence while giving the speaker plausible deniability. If confronted, they can easily claim they were joking or that you misunderstood their tone. Belittling language works in a similar way by subtly positioning one person as intellectually or emotionally superior. Phrases like, "You wouldn't understand," "Let the adults handle this," or "That's a childish way to think," communicate that your thoughts are not taken seriously. Over time, repeated exposure to this type of communication can create a power imbalance where one person constantly feels judged, corrected, or diminished. Contempt is particularly damaging because it combines disrespect with a sense of superiority. It often appears through dismissive laughter, condescending explanations, or statements that imply your perspective is worthless. In relationships, contempt has a corrosive effect because it replaces mutual respect with constant criticism and mockery. The person receiving it may start hesitating before speaking, fearing they will be ridiculed or talked down to. Healthy communication allows disagreement without degrading the other person. People can challenge ideas, express different viewpoints, and even debate strongly while still maintaining basic respect in tone and language. Contemptuous speech removes that respect and replaces dialogue with humiliation and dominance. Some people only recognize your value when they need something from you. In these situations, the relationship revolves around convenience rather than genuine respect or connection. You may notice that the person reaches out frequently when they require help, advice, resources, or emotional support. But when those needs disappear, so does their attention. Communication becomes irregular, and your presence in their life seems to depend entirely on what you can provide for them in that moment. This behavior can appear in many forms. Someone might call you whenever they are facing a problem and expect you to listen, offer solutions, or invest time helping them figure things out. Yet when you experience difficulties or need support yourself, they suddenly become unavailable or uninterested. Messages go unanswered, invitations are declined, or the conversation quickly shifts back to their own concerns. Over time, the pattern becomes clear. The connection is maintained only when it benefits them. Another sign of this dynamic is transactional behavior. The person treats interactions like exchanges where your usefulness determines your importance. If you can offer opportunities, connections, assistance, or emotional reassurance, they stay engaged. When you have nothing immediate to give, your presence becomes less relevant to them. This creates an uneven relationship where your role is defined primarily by what you contribute rather than who you are. Being in this kind of dynamic can gradually lead to feelings of being used or undervalued. You may start questioning whether the relationship would exist at all if you stopped offering help or resources. Because humans naturally want to feel needed and appreciated, it can sometimes be difficult to recognize when genuine appreciation is missing. Healthy relationships are built on mutual interest, care, and respect that continue even when no one needs anything in particular. Conversations, time together, and support flow in both directions without being tied to favors or obligations. When someone only values you during moments of personal benefit, the relationship stops being a connection between equals and becomes a system where one person's needs consistently take priority over the other's presence. Normalizing disrespect because of fear of conflict or rejection is a pattern many people fall into without realizing how harmful it can become over time. It begins when someone experiences behavior that feels wrong or uncomfortable, but chooses to ignore it in order to keep the peace. Instead of addressing the issue, they convince themselves that the situation is not serious enough to confront. They may think speaking up will create tension, damage the relationship, or cause others to see them as difficult or overly sensitive. This tendency often develops from a strong desire to be accepted or liked. People may worry that if they challenge disrespectful behavior, they will be rejected, excluded, or judged negatively. Because of this fear, they tolerate comments, actions, or attitudes that slowly cross personal boundaries. At first, the compromises may seem small. Someone might laugh off a rude remark, ignore a dismissive response, or pretend not to notice when their needs are overlooked. Over time, however, repeatedly overlooking these moments sends a silent message to others that the behavior is acceptable. People naturally adjust their behavior based on the reactions they receive. If disrespect goes unchallenged, it can gradually increase because there are no visible consequences for crossing those lines. What once felt uncomfortable may eventually start to feel normal, simply because it happens so often. Another consequence of normalizing disrespect is the internal frustration that builds up. Even if someone avoids open conflict with others, they often begin experiencing resentment, emotional exhaustion, or lowered self-esteem. Deep down, they recognize that their needs and dignity are being compromised, yet they feel trapped in a pattern where speaking up seems risky. Healthy relationships require honest communication and mutual respect. Addressing disrespect does not always mean confrontation or aggression, but it does involve acknowledging when something crosses a line. Choosing silence out of fear may preserve short-term harmony, but it can slowly create an environment where personal respect and boundaries are continuously ignored. Respect is one of the most important foundations of any healthy relationship, whether it's with friends, family, co-workers, or partners. When respect is present, communication feels safe, opinions are valued, and people treat each other with basic dignity. But when disrespect becomes tolerated, even in small ways, it slowly changes the dynamic of every interaction. The behaviors we talked about, being constantly dismissed, public humiliation disguised as jokes, boundary violations, gaslighting, being taken for granted, contemptuous language, being valued only when useful, and normalizing disrespect out of fear, may appear in subtle forms at first, but their long-term impact can be deeply damaging. The reality is that people often learn how to treat us based on what we consistently allow. When disrespectful actions are ignored, they can quietly become the new standard of behavior. Over time, this can affect confidence, self-worth, and emotional well-being. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward protecting your dignity and building relationships that are based on mutual regard rather than imbalance. Choosing not to tolerate disrespect does not mean becoming hostile or aggressive. It means developing the courage to acknowledge your worth and communicate your boundaries with clarity. Sometimes that involves speaking up, sometimes it means creating distance, and sometimes it requires re-evaluating whether a relationship truly deserves a place in your life. Healthy relationships grow stronger when both people feel respected, heard, and valued. When that foundation exists, trust deepens and communication becomes more honest and supportive. Protecting your self-respect is not about controlling others. It is about deciding the standards you are willing to live with. When you start honoring those standards, you naturally create space for people who treat you with the respect you deserve and remove the influence of those who refuse to do the same.